So I asked this question when we were going through rehearsal just a little while ago, and I immediately heard someone answer in the way that I would, so I laughed, and we'll see what happens. What comes to your mind when I say red pen? Close your eyes and try again. Red pen. How many of you thought of school papers, blue books, math tests, or English compositions? I know I did. It may be a cultural or an age thing, but in my generation, at least, teachers graded papers using red pen or pencil. I can still see the thick Bic felt tip pen writing of Mrs. Holton, my 5th grade teacher. So too can I see the thinner ballpoint red pen marks of my 7th grade math teacher, Mr. Petruzzi, with the grade always circled at the top. These are pleasant memories, and they're not. Pleasant because I loved school. It was haven for me. Not pleasant because every red mark indicated a mistake, something I should have known or could have done better. I was taught that by and large there was a right and a wrong answer. Even in classes allegedly designed to teach things like poetry, creative writing, critical thinking. There were still boundaries on the road. Many of us figured out what those boundaries were and dared not veer too far over the lines. This encultured belief I held of right and wrong led me to seek approval. I learned well how to play the game of whatever the situation. I also learned to quiet many parts of myself, including the most audacious, bold, and vulnerable parts. Along with right and wrong were societal teachings around good and bad. I knew early what it meant to be a good girl, what behavior was appropriate as it pertained to my sex and gender identity. This binary way of thinking and interacting with life went far beyond gender and grading of papers. It was integral to my worldview as a cisgendered white American female of European descent. There were exceptions, of course there were, including, thank goodness, in my Unitarian Universalist religion and upbringing, where in fact women were clergy. Diversity was valued, and theological differences were welcomed. Still, binary thinking was and is everywhere. It is integrated into ideas and judgments about relationships, opinions, and people. Binary thinking is when we have two opinions or two defining characteristics or two explanations or anything in two. And one is right and one is wrong. There's little or no room for gray, spectrum, or complexity. There's little or no room for middle ground, unless of course you're sure that the middle ground is the only answer, thereby sequestering people who disagree with that. So yes, binary thinking is a bit of a mind-bending thing. I am not sure that we as human beings can exist without some degree of binary thinking. And I just want to say right now that, at least for me and in what I'm sharing today, that's not the goal. That is not what I am proposing that we try to do, because that's a really good way to get stuck in arguing with me about that. as opposed to what else I might ask us to think about this morning. The goal is simply to become self-aware, to become aware of this tendency in our own selves and in society, and to have an openness to a difference of opinion, and to be open to experience and learn other people's perspectives and experiences. So I want to take a moment and just lift up some common binaries. And the Light on Community that we heard about, the Walk for Mother's Day Walk for Peace, brought another one to my mind just this morning. People will say to me often, the church we care about too much, too many things, too much. It's the earth, and it's black people, and it's this, and LGBT, it's all the. And what I hear in that is that I can't do all of that. Instead of recognizing that, aren't we blessed? None of us are asked to do all of it, nor to even necessarily care about all of it to the degree that we care about certain parts. We are all called to who we are, including the issues that speak to us the most. And aren't we blessed that we're a part of a community where there's room for all of it? What if we bowed to the people next to us and said, thank you for devoting your life and time to that issue to which you are called, and the others around you, while here I see this person and the others around them, and so on. I have shivers, not because of my booster shot for that. Other binaries, right? Male, female. Always, never. How about with relationships, right? Romantic relationships. People are coupled or single. Spiritual or religious. I care about social justice. I'm concerned about spirituality. And then we have the irrational but nonetheless powerful standards of things like perfection or broken. Able-bodied, disabled. There are endless examples where we take, again, opinions, thoughts, descriptions, definitions, and we put them into two things. Now, there are things we do understand as more complex. Of course, we recognize homosexual, bisexuals, and heterosexuals. And yet, how many of us recognize the great variance of degrees within those categories? Or religious beliefs, right? Is every Unitarian Universalist the same? Any more than every Hindu or every person of any faith? Or are there great variations within it? Which, yes, there are. The old binary belief of nature versus nurture, again, I'm showing you my age. Literally, I wrote papers that had red marks about that. I wrote the papers defending a particular position about nature versus nurture. And now it's understood that, in fact, that is a false binary. It isn't nature versus nurture. In a very simple way, we can say it is the interaction of these things that influences people. Singer, songwriter, opera singer, and author C.N. Lester writes that, quote, tackling binaries isn't an academic exercise, but something that cuts to the heart of who we are as individuals and as societies. The binary is where we default if we're not conscious. It's also where we go when we're threatened, overwhelmed, or simply tired. And it's understandable. We as humans want to know an answer. We want things to make sense. The world can be really overwhelming at times. And change is so rapid. And we say to ourselves, or at least I know I do, can't some things just stay the same? I prefer to understand things just as they've always been, we might say to ourselves. In his book, Think Again, organizational psychologist and author Adam Grant explains the binary bias, which is what I'm describing, not only what it is, but our human bias toward it, like it's what we like. He says that it is, quote, a basic human tendency to seek clarity and closure by simplifying a complex continuum into two categories. He writes about how changing long-held beliefs feels scary. We want to hold on to what we know. And changing an opinion or a decision can be akin to changing our self-identity. That's one I've been sitting with since I've read that. He encourages us to decouple our beliefs from who we understand ourselves to be. He says, we favor the comfort of conviction over the discomfort of doubt. And we let our beliefs get brittle long before our bones. He advocates that one of the most important skills of our times is the ability to relearn. Let me say it again. One of the most important skills of these times is the ability to relearn, to reconsider what we originally learned or think is true and be open to thinking differently. In fact, I would say, as you use, we pride ourselves on being pretty open-minded. And I ask us all, myself included, so what opinions and views have I changed in the last, pick a time, 2 months, 6 months, a year or two? He says, and I quote, this is Adam Grant, intelligence is traditionally viewed as the ability to think and learn. Yet in a turbulent world, such as ours, there's another set of cognitive skills that might matter more. The ability to rethink and unlearn. This is both a skill set and a mindset. Going beyond the binary often requires us to relearn what we think we know. And it's not easy. It asks us to suspend judgment, to be open-minded, humble, and hence vulnerable. And it doesn't end there. Living in a non-binary or even less non-binary understanding of the world takes maturity. Because it means we acknowledge that we live in a complex world, and there often are not easy and simple answers. Living beyond the binary requires room for complexity, uncertainty, and paradox, all of which are generally uncomfortable. It's helpful, Grant says, if we learn to recognize complexity as credibility. That is a different way of thinking. It's not those who are so certain they're right. What if we actually saw something being complex or not simply answered as actually more credible? What if we allow time and space to be confused in our own lives? What if we approach confusion with curiosity? He uses this phrase that I really like. He says, I need time for my confusion. There's a difference, however, between recognizing that unlearning takes time and using that as an excuse to remain confused or not ultimately make a decision. One of the paradoxes of this whole thing is that we need to make a decision, even in the face of complexity, which is in itself binary thinking. There are many places I could go to in this sermon, numerous binaries to expand and debunk. I'm going to stay with gender for the last third of this because it's an issue relevant and important to our church, for individuals and as a collective. I do invite us, however, to extend this exploration beyond gender. There's a lot of good writing and research about this topic, and it's critically important as we live in a society that is increasingly polarized, especially politically. So if you will join me in a journey around gender. I want to start with a definition by the World Health Organization. And again, I chose on purpose some resources that are quite neutral. This is their definition of gender. Quote, "It is the socially constructed characteristics of women and men, such as norms, roles, and relationships of and between groups. It varies from society to society and can be changed. When individuals or groups do not fit established gender norms, they often face stigma, discriminatory practices, or social exclusion, all of which adversely affect health. It is important to be sensitive to different identities that do not necessarily fit into binary male or female sex categories." That's the World Health Organization. National Geographic approaches the issue of the gender binary with great seriousness. Their 2017 special edition was dedicated entirely to this topic. And they wrote this in their introduction: "Something profound is happening around gender, whether we choose to see it or not. We thought these stories need to be illuminated. These are not the stories of celebrities in evening dresses on magazine covers, but those of regular people around the world whose choices are changing our societies. I commend them for their bravery in letting us see into the good and the bad of their lives. The stories, experiences, and expression of gender are changing quickly and are no longer binary, not that they ever were. In a 2015 study in the United Kingdom, 43% of 18 to 24-year-olds place themselves in the non-binary description. And yet there's no legal recognition of non-binary genders in most places. National Geographic editor-in-chief Susan Goldberg writes, and I quote, "Now that we know XX and XY and pink blue don't tell the full story, it's time to write a new chapter to ensure that we can all thrive in this world, no matter what our gender or decision to not identify a gender." We, the FRS, have an annual meeting fast approaching on June 12th, at which time we will, among other things, be voting again on the proposal to change the pronouns in our bylaws to be gender neutral. This entails 6 incidences in the bylaws, most of which refer to the minister. And changing that language from what it currently says, he, she, to read they. Sadly, it appears to me that this has become a binary issue of its own in our congregation, with those who agree and those who do not agree. We've been spending some time this year on reflecting on our history, and we'll certainly do more of that as we approach our 300th anniversary in 2025. But I found myself, when I was writing this sermon last week, wondering, truthfully wondering, and calling forth our forebearers. And I wondered what they would say if they were here right now. We've heard stories of people leaving the congregation in the past because we took down the American flag in the sanctuary. Seems a little outlandish to us now. We've heard people leaving the congregation because the hymnals were changed to a more recent version, the gray ones that we use at this time. Or leaving because we took the Lord's Prayer out of the weekly liturgy. I think today we might have more people leaving if we introduced it back into the weekly liturgy. Is this that time again? Is change underfoot in our society, and as a religious body, are we in relationship to that change? Ralph Waldo Emerson said, "The revelation of thought takes people out of servitude and into freedom. We are a religious body who stands for inclusion and the inherent worth and dignity of every person. We recognize the right of each person to a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. And if that's true in theology, it is most certainly true in self-identity, self-understanding, and self-expression. The decision of changing the pronouns in our bylaws to gender-neutral language is about respect for all people. I, just speaking for myself, I will not tell other people what I call them. I will ask who they are. I'll be honored when they share their story with me. And I will call them by their true names as they determine them. And I will respect their journey in every way possible. These principles of freedom of expression and belief, they're bedrock to our faith and this church, long before it was even Unitarian Universalist. This congregation has stood in this city with a steeple beckoning a message of religious tolerance and freedom of expression and sanctuary to those in need of safety for 300 years. I believe our forebearers would applaud the work we're doing next door and in the community. I think they would tell us to remember our children and to care for them and preserve this religious society for their future. I believe they would remind us to care for one another always and not to get entangled in unnecessary strife, but to hold true to the doctrine of this church. Love. Amen, and blessed be.